Hello, everyone. On this podcast episode, I'm going to talk about atheism again. Once in a while, I talk about atheism and how illogical it is to be an atheist. So I'm going to go over it again, why I believe being an atheist is very illogical. In my podcast, I talk a lot about God, and I've talked about, the proofs of the existence of God in many, many ways. You can prove that God exists in many, many ways. You can. And I've done it many times on my, episodes. But let's not talk about proving God exists in this episode. Let's talk about atheism and why it is illogical to be an atheist. Atheists believe that God doesn't exist. That's what an atheist is. They lack a belief in God, right? But you have to wonder, why do you not believe that God exists? When asking atheists why they believe that God doesn't exist, they tell you they don't need to provide proof that God doesn't exist. They just believe it anyways. They say it is the Christians, it is the theists that have to prove that God exists, not them. And since theists can't prove that God exists, it means God doesn't exist. But that's illogical. So let me give you an example of why it is illogical. If someone claims that they're innocent, right? Is it logical to say they're not innocent without evidence? For example, if someone works at an office, right? And then within that office, the day they work there, someone dies. Someone was murdered in their office. If someone was murdered in that person's office, and then the person goes home, then, the next day the cops come to the person's house and arrest them. And then the person tells them, I am innocent. I don't know what happened in that office. I only work there. I am innocent. Do you think the cops have a right to say, you're not innocent without evidence? Do you think the cops have the right to claim that a person who claims they're innocent isn't innocent without evidence? That's what atheists are doing. Saying that God doesn't exist, yet, refusing to prove that God doesn't exist, is no different from saying that someone is not innocent and refusing to prove that they're not innocent. If someone claims they're innocent, if you don't want to believe they're innocent, find proof that they're not. You must prove that someone is not innocent. Atheists keep lying to you by telling you that you can't prove a negative. Yes, you can. If you can prove something is positive, if you can prove something is positively charged, you can prove something is negatively charged. If you can prove one aspect of the world, you can prove its equal and opposite. You can prove someone is tall. You can prove someone is short. You can prove someone is standing on the left. You can prove someone is standing on the right. You can prove someone is over here. You can prove its equal and opposite, that someone is over there instead. You can prove something is hot. You can also prove the equal and opposite, that something else is cold. You can prove one thing in life. You can also prove its equal and opposite. If it's possible to prove that God exists, it must also be possible to prove that God doesn't exist. If it's possible to prove a positive, it must also be possible to prove a negative. If it's possible for someone to prove that they're innocent, it must also be possible for you to prove that they're not innocent. If you claim that someone is not innocent, you must prove it. You can't just make claims without proof. You can't make claims without evidence. Claiming that God doesn't exist is still a claim. Believing that God doesn't exist is still a claim. You must prove that God doesn't exist. If you can't prove that God doesn't exist, yet you still believe it anyways, then you're the illogical one, not theists. The people who believe in God for a reason, a logical reason. Yet here you are as an atheist, believing that God doesn't exist without any evidence. Atheists keep claiming that God doesn't exist, yet they keep claiming that you can't prove that God doesn't exist. That is also a claim they haven't proven yet. If you can prove God exists, you can also prove God doesn't. When an atheist believes that God doesn't exist without evidence, it's no different from someone believing that an innocent person is not innocent without evidence. Do you think it's fair if the person that I talked about earlier, who worked at an office where someone was murdered, were seen as guilty without evidence? That person claims they're innocent, but here an atheist comes and tells them they're not innocent. When the person asks them, okay, bring proof that I'm not innocent, bring proof. Guess what the atheist tells them? You can't prove a negative. That's the excuse of an atheist. That's all the evidence that an atheist has. All they claim is you can't prove a negative. Since you can't prove a negative, it means you're not innocent. Since they can't prove a negative, it means God doesn't exist. Isn't that illogical? Isn't it illogical to say that someone is not innocent without evidence? If someone claims they're innocent, it is on them to prove they're innocent. If someone claims they're not innocent, it is still on them to prove that someone is not innocent. In the United States, the court works through, this process. The court always believes that someone is innocent until proven guilty, right? That's how the U.S. system works. Someone is innocent until proven guilty. The atheist mindset is the opposite. Someone is guilty until proven innocent. If you don't prove that you're innocent, it automatically means you're guilty. If the person who worked at a place that someone was murdered in can't prove that they're innocent, it automatically means they're guilty. If a Christian can't prove that God exists, it automatically means God doesn't exist. That's the mindset of an atheist. The mindset of someone who believes someone is guilty without any evidence whatsoever. They've already become closed-minded. They no longer care about the truth. The moment you've already determined that someone is guilty without evidence, no amount of evidence will ever change your mind. And that's the problem with atheism. They've already decided that God doesn't exist without evidence. So no amount of evidence will ever change their mind. They've become closed-minded people. They don't care about the truth. Because if they cared about the truth, they would not be atheists. If you cared about evidence, you would not believe that God doesn't exist without evidence that God doesn't exist. You have to bring proof. You have to bring evidence that supports your claims, that supports your beliefs. If you don't have evidence that supports your beliefs, just mocking Christians doesn't do it. The mindset of most atheists is as long as they can mock Christians, as long as they can mock people who believe in God for believing in God, it automatically means they're correct. But that's not how this world works. That's not how facts works. You can lie all day, but the truth will still be the truth. God exists. You can insult Christians all day for believing in God. You can mock them all day for believing in God, like fools. But they believe in God because they have evidence. You believe that God doesn't exist without evidence. Who's the real fool now? Who's the illogical one? You can find many evidences that prove that God exists. I have so many episodes that I talk about it. It goes on and on. It's very easy to prove that God exists. Very, very easy. Why do you think there's still atheists? In a world where it's easy to prove that God exists, why do you think there's still atheists? Because atheists believe that God doesn't exist without evidence. Since they've already arrived at a false conclusion. With that mindset, the mindset that I have, is it a mindset of someone who cares about evidence? When you already believe that God doesn't exist without evidence, would you really care about evidence from then on? No. That's the problem with atheists. It's not that there isn't evidence around to prove that God exists. It's that they don't care about the evidence. It's not about evidence. Atheists already believe they're better than Christians. Atheists already believe they're more logical, more intelligent than people who believe in God. In their minds, they're correct. In their minds, they are the logical ones. Even though nothing they say makes logical sense, in their minds, they are the logical ones. Because they already believe they're the logical ones. Everything a Christian tells them will be logical from their perspective. It will no longer make logical sense. That's why they're called closed-minded. They don't care about the truth. The truth doesn't work for an atheist. It doesn't. If they cared about the truth, there will not be atheists. An atheist doesn't care about evidence. Otherwise, there will not be atheists. If they cared about evidence, they will provide evidence that God doesn't exist before they believe that God doesn't exist. Just like if you believe that someone is not innocent, you must provide evidence to prove that someone is not innocent. You can't just assume that someone is not innocent without evidence. You can't just claim that. Proving that someone is not innocent is a negative and that you can't prove a negative. Stop making claims. Atheists always make claims. Atheists always lie. That's why the Bible warns you of atheists. They're called the Antichrist. The Bible warns you of the Antichrist. The Antichrist doesn't care about the truth. The Antichrist doesn't care about logic. It only cares about deceiving you. It only cares about tricking you into thinking that the lies are the truth and the truth are the lies. The world of atheism is a world of lies. They don't care about the truth. If they cared about the truth, there will not be atheists. There'll be something else. Definitely not atheists. That's why you need to be careful in life. Do not be deceived by liars. Atheists are liars. In the world of liars, the truth gets mocked. In the world of atheists, when you bring the truth to their doorstep, they will mock you. They will insult you for telling the truth. They will bully you for telling the truth. Basic facts become lies in their world, and lies become basic facts. One of those lies is you can't prove a negative. They're so deluded, in the world of lies, that things that make no logical sense becomes the only truth in their eyes. Things that make no logical sense becomes the right answer. When you ignore the only correct answer, all you have left is the wrong answer to choose from. Atheists have already ignored the only correct answer, and that answer is God is the world itself. Stop looking for God outside of the world. The Bible tells you, through God, all things exist. Through this world, all things exist. The Bible tells you, God is omnipresent. When you become omnipresent, you become the world itself. God is the world itself. The Bible tells you, God is omniscient. Nothing can be more omniscient than the world. Nothing can be more omnipresent than the world. Nothing can be more omnipotent than the world. And nothing can be more intelligent than the world. Human beings cannot be more intelligent than the world, because human beings are the world. A single cell in a human body cannot be more intelligent than the human body. Why? Because a single cell is still part of the human body. A single cell in your body cannot be more intelligent than you are, because that cell is still you. Human beings cannot be more intelligent than the world, because human beings are still the world. The world is intelligent. The world is omnipresent. The world is omnipotent. And the world is omniscient. Through the world, all things exist. Is it not true? Where do you think your intelligence comes from? It comes from the world itself. Where do you think your logic, your mind comes from? It comes from the world itself. Where do you think your life comes from? It comes from the world itself. Where do you think everything you know comes from? It comes from the world itself. Through the world, all things exist. Through God, all things exist. God and the world are synonymous. God is everything. That's why God is omnipresent. God is the world. That's why God is omnipotent. God is the world. That's why God is omniscient. That is the only correct answer. When you ignore the only correct answer, all you'll have left will be the wrong answer to choose from. When you ignore the fact that the world is God, that the world is intelligent, all you have left will be the wrong answer to choose from. Atheists can only direct you towards the wrong answers, because they've already ignored the correct answer. And the correct answer is, through God all things exist. God is the world itself, because through this world all things exist. Intelligence can only exist through this world. Intelligence exists only through this world. Energy exists only through this world. Time exists only through this world. Everything you know and love comes from the world itself, because the world itself is God. And that's what the Bible keeps telling you. In the beginning was the world, and the world was with God, and the world was God. The very world itself is God. Everything you know is God. Through God, all things are possible. Through God, all things exist. If you ignore the only answer that's true, all you have left will be the wrong answer to choose from. Atheists have ignored the only correct answer. That's why all they have left will be lies and manipulation. The only thing an atheist can do is deceive you. That's all they can do. Mock, bully, and deceive you. Because they don't have the correct answer. They can't prove that God doesn't exist. They don't know how. Yet I do. They don't know how to prove that God doesn't exist. Yet they still believe it anyways. They don't know how this world works. Yet they still believe they have it all figured out anyways. They can't tell that the very definition of God is the very definition of the world itself. God is the world itself. That's why you're intelligent. The world is intelligent. That's why humans are intelligent. The world has energy. That's why humans have energy. The world has a mind. That's why humans have a mind. The world has time. That's why humans experience time. What we humans have all come from the world itself. Through the world, everything is possible. Through God, everything is possible. Do not be deceived by liars. Atheists are liars. Do not be deceived by fools. Atheists are fools. The only correct answer is that God exists. The only logical answer is that the world itself is God. Because the moment you become omnipresent, you become the world itself. You can't be more omnipresent than the world itself. God is the world itself. And the world is real. Saying God doesn't exist is no different from saying that the world doesn't exist. Saying God isn't real is no different from saying that you aren't real. Because you're still the world. You're still part of God. Everything in this world is God. That's why God is omnipresent. That's the very definition of omnipresent. You are everything. God is everything. God is the world itself. So that's it for today's podcast episode. Be very careful of atheists. They're liars. They're deceivers. They will never tell the truth because they don't have the truth to tell. I pray for everyone's safety and understanding. Amen.